thank you very much for holding up with us for such a long time. We had a very intensive day, quite some debates already, but very, I guess, important and helpful in terms of learning lessons, helpful interventions from the speakers. What I'd like to start with is trying to get the co-organizers a little bit into the debate, and I may take the liberty to start with Mr. Moslechner, who in his introduction already related to a somewhat difficult challenge, I guess. Namely, the challenge, on the one hand, to be a key representative of a system which is not, in the case of the Austrian Notenbank, but in the case of the financial system, sector proper, addressed as being one of the key challenges we face today when it comes to reform, or to change, or to alter that system, and which is often addressed as one of the underlying causes of the financial sector in some respects, that we ran into quite dramatic episodes of change and uncertainty. And my more specific question relates to the dilemma, if there is a dilemma, that's being among the board of directors of the National Notenbank, being part of the decision of the European Notenbank, so to say, to lower the interest rates to the lowest level ever experienced, with a clear motive, which is unspoken, I should also say, in European politics, and that is to fuel consumption again. And through that mechanism, fueling consumption, fueling also production volumes, and making the economy grow faster than it did grow or not grow during the last couple of years. And that being seen vis-à-vis the mandate and the vision of the president of the Austrian chapter of the Club of Rome, a club which by and large became famous also through its unspoken commitment that there is limits to growth and that we have to respect these limits. This creates, from my personal view, an interesting challenge to handle that dichotomy in some way, and I'd be very interested to have your reflections on that.
Two quick reactions as an introduction. First, next question, please. Second, how much time do I have to respond to this? I think this is you addressed so many important but really extensive issues that it's impossible, of course, to answer this, but you are completely right that these tensions are there, these inconsistencies. But let me go back to what Dennis Meadows said in the morning. I think there's one common topic in all this, and he mentioned resilience. So resilience in the sense he talked about it is also a very important element from my point of view of, on the one hand, the dynamics of structural change in the economy and the functioning of markets in our present setting of the economy we have. What we have seen over the last decades, talking from a financial market and economic perspective, is that there were structural developments for ideological and whatever reasons, which obviously reduced the level of resilience we had in our market economy. But, and that makes it even more fascinating, and that's why we could talk hours about this, they were introduced with the argument that this will increase the resilience of the system because the flexibility will go up, the adaptivity of the system will be improved. This was a specific mainstream thinking of how the market should be organized and which direction they should develop with an idea that afterwards we have a more efficient, as you said, market system which is able to produce more economic welfare in the end as it was before. It turned out that this belief was the wrong one. It led us into another big crisis, and we have seen that the resilience of the market, in particular financial market, is no longer at an appropriate level. There's one important element as a complement to this. There's a thing we call unemployment in the system. So one of the big objectives economic development should focus on is to reduce unemployment to the lowest possible level. And the question is, how should we structure our economic system, the market system, to achieve this goal? We see that almost all over the world, less in Austria, but almost all over the world, we fail continuously to achieve this. But I think there is one big issue which central banks and governments are concerned all the time, that under present emergency conditions, you have to do some emergency measures to keep the system from breaking down completely, even if they are not in line with the long-term objectives you have in mind. So the idea is that there's some sort of distinction between what you have to do in the short run to stabilize the system first, to keep it from breaking apart. But then, as a next step, from my point of view, it would be obvious to find a new long-term, much more stable, much more resilient solution. And this also brings me to the measures undertaken by the ECB in particular, but long before also by the other central banks, the Federal Reserve System and the Bank of England. To a large extent, they are addressed to restore the financing of the real economy. Because what's missing, obviously, is profitable, as the MS has also illustrated, profitable real investment to increase capacity and to reduce the level of unemployment. And that's the main goal of these measures in the end.
Thank you. Helen, part of the notes we took and collected were addressing the question that maybe goes to Herman and Fidilko too, whether we are rightly expressing our hopes in the young generation, 3D approaches and things like that, and whether we're not facing, at least in the industrialized countries, a counter-movement of a new future perception of parts of that generation. Rather giving up their social bindings and different means to engage. Would you share that there's these conflicting tendencies we're facing? Would you have suggestions or ideas on how we can manage this challenge that although when you refer to the situation in Japan, figuring that some 10% of the young people would be open to that kind of approach, that on the other hand means that a great majority of the young people are very fond of that kind of approach. They try to continue the ways they continue before, looking for something completely different. And that also includes loosening their social bindings with other parts of the community.
Yeah. Well, I think the young people need challenges, difficult challenges to get experiences to master them. This makes them resilient. Because if you provide for young people or remove all the problems for them, then they have no, I would say, positive experiences, that they can do something, that they can change something. I remember in my very long career as a teacher, in the 70s, the 80s, we recognized that many of the students were not eager very much to do what should be done. They were trying to stay on the lowest level with the lowest amount of effort and something like that. And they asked them, well, what is going on in your generation? And they said to me, well, we have everything. Our parents have built up everything, so we have only to keep it running, something like that. And the next generation was not even interesting to keep it running. So what the young generation is doing, they are looking for some challenges. And if you don't give them, which is really the case today, because they don't have the space anymore where they can experience by themselves, they don't have the space, which is my specialty, and also international experience too. They don't have the life space anymore where they can make something which is not officially allowed or something like that. And then they are very easily coming into criminality and something like that. You need some freedom for them, and this key kind of freedom is important. The second one is, I think these are the first generations which had not the opportunity to learn from the adults. They are totally separated in their life from the real life and the work of the parents and grandparents. I was lucky to grow up in a village where I had contact with different professions. I could watch and I could see what the people were doing there, and so we could learn about them. Today the children are more or less in cages, in the kindergarten, then they are in the cage of the school, then in the cage of the home, then in the cage of the car, and the elevator, and so on. It's a life of cages. And if you look what is going on with the animals who are living in cages, they fear to go out in the open field. There are very nice films, and this is exactly what is going on. But from inside, they wanted to do something which show them what is a little bit risky and something like that. The environment has changed totally. They are growing up in a technical environment which was not designed for children and something like that. I was, I think, 5 years ago in Japan and was invited by Nissan thanks to Junka's organization. And the management there asked me, told me that they have problems to sell the cars anymore in Japan because the younger generation don't buy so many cars as before. They make this either the indoor sports or something like that, or they are away in the virtual reality, which is happening today. We are at the moment analyzing the behavior of users of public transport in Vienna with the conflict situation with the cyclists. I didn't expect what I see on our videotapes. The people are not looking to anything, to anybody. They are just looking to their iPod or what they have, and they see a red shadow coming in, and this might be the tram. And then they enter the tram, and then they exit the tram. And on the other side, you have the bikes. They have two things in the ears. Well, they don't have anything in front of them because they couldn't survive in this way, but this is the situation today. I think much more than half of the people we can watch in the public space. When you have this kind of people, they don't recognize anymore about other people's. They, I think, will have problems to develop empathy for the people around them. Maybe they have empathy for somebody in the United States or somewhere else, of their Facebook friends. They are always looking for them. But I think this is endangering the future of the society also, and they have a certain feeling. But one of the members of the Podiumsdiskussion group, Max Neef, has analyzed the basic needs of humans in a very good manner, and the people must do something. They must go in contact with the people, which is very much important, and they must be, and they should do what they can. We cannot do, the children, the young people cannot do so much as they should. And they are looking for some opportunities. And if I think, if we use this kind of opportunities and give them free and let them out of our industrial mental complex, we are always thinking when we are talking about the industrial situation and industrial production and so hard facts. we have also a kind of industrial thinking in social terms and something like that. This fixed working time and this kind of organization of schools and so on. I have many doubts whether we learn very much in the schools. I think you can learn much more by watching what is going around you if the environment is interesting. And this can open the eyes, because our brain is not so bad, but our brain has a big risk, which Konrad Lorenz has very well described. This is a new value limb of our body, as my brother has already demonstrated a little bit by going into the evolution process. We are the only being which believes on total nonsense. And this is the advantage of the neocortex. Because I know it, coming back to the money terms, you can cheat people by showing them a piece of paper. Because they believe on the power of this paper and it works very well. Today it is not even necessary to show them a piece of paper, you just show them some figures on the screen, which is the today situation in money transfer and something like that. But if I give my dog a piece of paper, well, he's not interested at all. He looks what is really important for him. And I think we should keep also our ratio morph abilities, because we think our ratio is so strong. It is the weakest part of our total evolution. We have no experience, and we make most of the mistakes in the neocortex. Normally you would not use this kind of tool in industrial production.
How do you manage to emotionalize that segment of the population? I'm sorry. How do you manage to emotionalize if you address that part of the population, to empower them to take their states by themselves, to get engaged in their ways?
Yes. I think in the past, when young people had different ideas for future, or different ideas, they were engaged into the fighting against status quo, or fighting against establishment. But what I have been seeing in Japan is young people not fighting against us, older generations, but they're just withdrawing from the status quo, or they're escaping from the existing structure of the society, and very slowly, very quietly. So they are not advocating the change we need to have for the future. But that is a big difference what I have been seeing, fighting against status quo, or just escaping or withdrawing themselves from the existing social structure. And for example, there is a very well-known movie in Japan. This is not mass media type of movie, but the literal translation of the title is Downshifting Your Life, or Transcending Down. So this is the story, one very Japanese type of hectic, busy business person had some insight after some incident or story, and he decided to step down from his luxurious and money-oriented life. So departure from the money-oriented life, that is the theme of the movie. This is not a movie for big cinema, but this movie has been expanded by grassroots movement, and after 5 years of staging of the movie, now over 100,000 people went to see the movie. So this is a very quiet expansion of the values and people. And when I think about the young generation in Japan, as I said, maybe 10% of the people are very eager to change their lifestyle for 3D type of things. But on the other hand, I think only 10% of the people have the aspiration of older generation to get promoted, to become president. there is a very interesting poll in Japan asking the young generation, what is the goal of working for this company? In the past, many people say that the goal for working in this company is to become president or getting promoted to the higher management level. But nowadays, many people say that, no, I don't want to get promoted. I just want to spend some time in the company to receive some income so that I can sustain my life. But I don't want to get into the very hectic and the business style. And so the remaining 80%, I think, is seeking so-so lifestyle. They don't want to become president of the company, but they are not going for countryside to change their lifestyle. But they are very happy with, for example, Facebook or the Line or SNS type of communication, and they are very happy with spending the time with their close friends in the neighborhood area. They don't want to have challenges. They don't have that kind of aspiration to go up. So I think what we can do as older generation is not get in their life and get their ways. I mean, we don't have to, or we shouldn't interfere what they are trying to do. And so let them do what they believe is important for themselves. So in the past, people are getting together to create changes for societal revolution. But I can see in Japan is that they are changing their lifestyle not for societal revolution, but for them, for their personal happiness. But collectively, that will lead to the societal revolution. That's what I will see in Japan.
Thank you. One of the issues which is outlined here and is specifically addressed to Dennis, assuming that he has had and still has a lot of access to these people, is how do you address opinion leaders with that kind of inconvenient truth we were talking about today, the challenges at place right now at the moment, and the big changes, unprecedented big changes for the last several hundred years to come. Is that a clue that we address the opinion leaders and decision makers in a way different from the way we do, so that they do realize? Or is that a one-way approach which does not really work? I just talk to the opinion leaders and make them believers, and then things will get better.
So the question is, do I address opinion leaders, and how do I address opinion leaders? The first question is easy to answer. I don't address opinion leaders. There is almost zero interest in these issues in the United States. And there aren't so many opinion leaders in this room. We are, by and large, talking to ourselves. Now, should you talk to opinion leaders? Does the solution lie with opinion leaders? Do opinion leaders have, these days, the power to do this? I don't think so. Another question on the board over there got off into an issue of democracy, dictatorship, and so forth. Those two questions are related. Opinion leaders are interesting to us in a democracy. At least a decentralized group of opinion leaders are interesting to us in a democracy. In a dictatorship, then it's a rather small group of people that you're interested in. What about democracy and dictatorship? professor, I'm always willing to talk about anything. So let me just mention just very briefly this issue of just dictatorship and democracy, because I think it has an important lesson for us. I think it's important to remember that democracy, whatever that means exactly, is an extremely recent and still minority form of government. Even here in Austria, where the democracy these days is relatively healthy, if you think back over your history, you have been under a democratic system for an extremely small fraction of time. There was a period of dictatorship here, didn't end up working out very well. There was some centuries of being under a monarchy. But actually, the most long-term form of governance in Austria was not any of those. It was tribal system. Small villages, tribal leaders, council of elders, very traditional forms. So when we look ahead, when I look ahead over the next 50 or 100 years, I don't assume that the problems I'm thinking about will be dealt with in a context of a democratic system. It's an absolute empirical fact that democracies, the United States, the European Union, and are not dealing with a number of life and death issues. We aren't dealing with climate change. We talk about it, we have conferences about it, but meanwhile, greenhouse gases keep going up. We aren't dealing with the depletion of fossil fuels. We aren't dealing at the moment even with the Ebola epidemic, which is potentially a life-threatening thing for the planet. So it's an empirical fact that the various forms of democracy are not dealing with these issues. And actually, you would expect that to be the case. I mean, what is democracy? Democracy is basically, it's a governance form which puts power to a small group of people and institutions because of the benefits that they give to the voters. And the voters have a very short-term perspective. They aren't thinking, what benefits are you going to give me 30 years from now? We say in English, you know, what have you done for me recently? So when you have global problems where you have to work for years and pay a lot in order that later in the great distant future some benefits come back, you wouldn't expect it would be managed by a democracy. It will take something else. Now, what will it take? Does that mean dictatorship? No, I hope not, because most of the dictatorships also don't work very well. But to imagine that a species, us, who have been on this earth for 200,000 years, can only pick between democracy and dictatorship is a very shallow understanding of what possibilities exist for us to create our governance systems. So I honestly don't know what's coming. I'll tell you what's emerging over the decade, next couple decades, but it's a transition because it also won't work. What's emerging is I would use this term, except it has some political connotations, which sometimes, in some contexts, I would use the term fascist, but that brings ideas which actually aren't correct here. What's emerging is a collaborative effort between the industrial financial leaders, international financial industrial leaders, and the international military police leaders. I don't think they meet in secret rooms and plan how they're going to do this, but they are the two centers which have economic and political power and a relatively long-term perspective, relatively, and a strong desire to keep things in an orderly way. So there's a natural drift over to give power. We see it in the United States now, for example. Military equipment is flowing out to the police forces in towns. I mean, it's just amazing. The international bankers now sit down and try to, they're not corrupt and they're not shorts, I mean, they're honestly trying to deal with the problem, but that doesn't alter the fact power is drifting over into their camp. The international bankers are now coordinating international financial power. There's actually, in many ways, not much difference between what's being done by China, Japan, the United States, England, and now the European Union. Phasing this. So that's what's emerging for the moment. Power is drifting away from the national states to these larger bodies. And that's a trend which I think will unfold over the next 30, 40 years. But it won't work. It's because it's not dealing fundamentally with the problems either. And so finally that will pass on to something else. But you know, that's what's going on. But in that context, you know, you don't sit down with a coffee and talk to some opinion leader about climate change. I mean, it has no meaning.
Helen, you also wanted to comment on that. Just to add to what Dennis said, is it a question of democracy versus another approach, or is this rather a question of looking at the governance tools democracy has in place at the moment, which are apparently very poor tools to achieve the goals we try to tackle, like the complete lack of participation Yoko was addressing in decision preparation and making process in Japan.
Of course, when we use the term democracy, we apply that to an enormously different set of governing systems. What is called democracy in Sweden is incredibly different than what's called democracy in Japan. And what is democracy in my village is different than what is called democracy in my national capital. We have come simplistically to think that democracy is somehow where people get to take a piece of paper, you know, and put a name on it and put it in a box. That's an incredibly unsophisticated understanding of democracy. Democracy is a deep conviction that there should be open information, that people should be responsible for their mistakes, that leaders should have a moral responsibility to do things which aren't in their own short-term interests in order to promote the well-being of the larger society. If those things existed, democracy in small groupings could work, I think, but they don't exist, and they are actually disappearing. And so finally, you know, we have the, I call it even an obscenity, really, democracy in Afghanistan. You know, it's just a total, it's a farce. It's a show which has no meaning, and that kind of democracy never is going to work. So to say that democracy isn't working doesn't mean that we shouldn't look for solutions inside the democracy. But we don't start, you know, with a little piece of paper. We start by educating our children, inculcating a sense of responsibility to the society, a sense of taking personal responsibility when you make a mistake, and things like that. That's what really takes it.
Is is this something like it was described by the German Science Advisory Council for Global Change and Environmental Protection as a new societal contract within our democratic repertoire? Is this something which could be envisaged, and how could that be shaped? Herman?
I think we have a very good example, not very far from Austria. This is Switzerland. Because democracy has to be based on trust between the people who have the rules and the individuals with the politicians. And this can only happen if you don't give too much power to the people who have the power. And this is the case in Switzerland. First of all, the trust. Everybody who is a Swiss resident gets the whole amount of money he earns. And then he has to pay for insurance, tax to the city, tax to the state, and tax to the canton. And they trust him that he will make a fair deal with them. They have a very low tax level, first of all. So there's a trust between the people above and the people down. And the Swiss people, if you talk with them, they tell us, well, if they don't make a good business, we take them down. And I know from my professional colleagues, if they want to spend public money over a certain amount, and I was wondering how low this amount was, at least some years ago, in the city of Bern. If they wanted to make investments over 200,000 Swiss francs, they have to ask the society and show them the project and ask for the money for permission to use it. And this is a principle, I think, which cannot be separated from an ideal situation, as you said, of a fantasy which is called democracy. If you don't organize the energy flows, which are in this case money flows, in principle, and flows of power in the democratic way. And the Swiss people say, well, that the politician can only use public money as a human, like I am as a human, to such amount as I can, as I'm able to take responsibility for it. I think this works very well. If you are as a foreigner in Switzerland, they don't trust you. They take away the taxes and other things and leave what normally is left over, as in our countries is the case. I think we should precisely define when we are using terms. We are using, for example, the term market. Market is a place where there is a lot of opportunities to choose between different opportunities and compare. When I'm going in Thailand or in India on a market, I have a huge amount of the same kind of goods in different qualities and different prices. And I can use my senses to check it, whether the price is in relationship with the quality I am expecting. If you go to, in our states, into a shop or a supermarket, you get a plastic bag of anything which has been bought there. And if you have some experience, you will recognize, well, it was the cheapest offer they could go there at the lowest quality, but you have no chance. You can only buy it in this way. This is the market, I think. And this is one of the greatest dangers, that our imagination always makes some expectation, like democracy, like market, and something like that. This is not a market at all, what is happening here. And also the question of money transfer. We are not able, we have not understood what's going really on. If you take 1 million euro and you transport them physically, let me say, from Austria to Singapore, you will not go very far, because you will not even be able to cross the Slovakian border or something like that, that somebody will recognize you are carrying 1 million euro. But if we are using the electronic means, we can send billions in nanoseconds from A to B, even much faster than we can recognize it. And this is one of the problems of today, like in my own profession, because the people think they can drive a car, which is totally nonsense, because the drive is going with them, the car is going with them. They are serving the car to survive in the car, and not to hit the other people. So this is one of the great dangers. If we don't make the precise definition and the right terms, we are running into problems and make a lot of mistakes.
Sherpa, when you were referring to the unstable period in Thailand in the years 11 till beginning of that year, with the enduring street demonstrations calling for change, what kind of democratic change were the people really looking forward? Were the people really up to engage in participatory decision-making processes? Were they expecting a completely different level of quality of life that needs to be achieved through that political change? What was their motive? Was their motive engagement?
Well, they don't want to engage until they are affected. If you know that the politicians always lead the understanding that democracy is something that you put the name of the person in the box. At 2 minutes or 1 minute democracy. And after that, you have nothing to do with the decision-making process. And then that's why they have gone the wrong way, far on the wrong way, and that also caused the uprising of people. Decision made by the top decision makers without letting the public know. For example, some of the big projects like dam, like the construction of the big, huge transportation scheme that leading the country to owe the money, make a million baht, owing international banks, which in this case the public should know, should be informed and get involved in the decision-making process. But it seems that the government just have no limit of the decision. They have no limit of the 200,000 Swiss francs they can do. That if we decided to go in that direction, we have to pay the debt of 50 years for the whole country. I mean, getting us into the situation that we owe international bank for 50 years, which in that case, the decision will be made in the cabinet. That is one of the reasons why there was an uprising in the country, that we want to do the tidy up a little bit and cleaning up the process is unwanted.
A question to Magnus. When you announced your talk, one of the things before your talk that came to my mind was an example of at that time called co-evolution, which I was taught as an example how things work in an evolutionary way to develop synergies at the system level. And that was the example between an anteater and its key favorite prey, which is termites. And the question we were debating at that time and being taught was, why did the anteater over time not develop an immuneness against termite bites? Because the fact is, most people don't know that, anteaters don't really like termite bites a lot. They hurt them. They're very annoying to them. And the evolutionary context, which was the translation for why does the anteater not develop an immunity against termite bites, was because if we would have done that, and certain gene pools in the anteater population would have probably provided that advantage, this competitive advantage, it would have outcompeted its own resource, namely the termite hills. It would have fed on a termite hill until it would have destroyed it. Whereas in reality, anteaters visit a termite hill and can't stand it for a very long time until they have to leave because it hurts them so much. So the system's advantage of not being a perfect anteater, which out of the evolutionary context of the evolution of the species proper would have been an advantage position. The system's advantage was that the perfect anteater would always overuse its resource until the resource is no longer there. And then it doesn't matter if you're a perfect anteater if they're not torment kills. So the lesson we were taught was that the survival value was of being an imperfect anteater. And my question now to Markus, is there other examples out of looking at evolutionary processes that co-evolution between species in a system interaction level gives us hints for the debate we've been having on the industrial systems level we approach for being an imperfect exploiter of natural resources will give us the system's advantage in terms of stabilizing the system rather than exploiting systems. There are examples that go into that direction that can illustrate to us that in evolutionary context, system persists because individual success within the system is not maximized, optimized in the system's context.
Okay. We have to be very careful in transformation of examples from biological evolution to human society.
It's a metaphor.
But because what I will try to explain is that in the human society, we have the situation that we have a huge potential to modify the environment and to modify it to our expectations. For example, I'm sitting here the whole day, and if you would ask how the weather was today, nobody could give an answer about the weather outside. And a similar situation which we have with our technology, where we are supported by energy and also buildings and so on, which is also reflected by our understanding and by our acceptance to use it. But we have big problems to deal with these challenges. For example, if you have, because there was a discussion about democracy, you can discuss relatively simple and directly with the process within a bigger group. If you have the challenge to deal, for example, with a larger industrial unit, I made the experience with the mediation process to the third runway of the Vienna airport, where we supported people with knowledge and we tried to explain to the participant what will function. My former experience was confirmed that you cannot explain a little bit more complex relationships to a bigger group. So we had to discuss with some selected people which were defined by the participant, and we explained the relationships to them, and these people explained from their point of view to the other one. And a much more extreme example presented it today with nuclear energy. I had was only one time as I worked with the International Atomic Energy. It was the discussion how to deal with nuclear energy in future, and there were a lot of modelers which presented the management of nuclear deposits for the next 10,000 years. And several models were presented, and then I asked the question how far the model are reliable, and they didn't understood what my question was, because they started to discuss, okay, we have this algorithm and so on. And I tried to explain what my point was. My point was that it makes no sense to present the behavior of a society in the next 10,000 years. And so I asked them, okay, who in the room is able to read at the moment a text from old Egypt? Only 5,000 years. So this was my last presentation in the atomic energy. We're in a gap. We're in a gap that we on one hand have very excellent knowledge, which can produce very excellent technology, but it cannot be anticipated by social behavior. And so we are in the situation self-organizing risk. Because you asked the question how fast we can adapt to disease, too fast. Because in our communication, even if we have a democratic situation that is passive, we cannot find out any arguments, or we can also not decide in which way we can manage complicated development. And if you look at the answer that is successful within a framework, because he's not so perfect. And this is another point which is very hard to view, because one of the programs within the European Union is to increase the efficiency. And this is a typical way, it's a typical downhill way, because if you increase the efficiency, you will be successful for a short time. But you will destroy so much other factors that at the end the system will break down. Because there's a misunderstanding of the relationship.
Thanks to Greg Love, also Marcus, to bring us back right into the core of our debate, the limits to, in many respects, with the resources we fuel our system, and the approach we take, namely to be more and more efficient to approach these limits, and not only to use the resources. I guess it is time now to invite you to come in with questions or remarks you would like to be addressed by us shortly. And I saw the lady in the third row asking for the floor first, and then the lady in the fourth row on the other side, and then the two attendants in the row behind her. I was referring to you, yes.
To Mr. Meadows, as long as the first priority to all workers in the world is to keep their jobs, because jobs are diamonds nowadays, how can you expect any of them to be reluctant to say, no, the goal of this company, I don't agree with it? This is my first question. Then a small question to Mr. Moslechner. I can't even realize how banks can act nowadays. If they give you credit, that's wrong. If they don't give you credit, it is wrong too. And if you observe the situation that the manager of the year is next year the bankrupter of the year, how can you judge bonity at all? And because you say flexibility in an euphemistic way to insecurity. It is insecurity, and I know you have to have reserves, a lot of reserves, but if you have a lot of reserves, then you have to increase the interest rates for the credits, and that's what people don't want. And just one small remark. We are now in that we have to get in the near future a transformation of our tax system. And the government is not saying we need this in order to have a more fair system, but we need this in order that people can consume more. Just imagine, it is the tax on labor, and we need this reform or this transformation because it is very high for the middle class. And I don't say we need this transformation because nowadays it is awfully unfair, but I say we need this in order that people can consume more.
Yeah, we just collect, I guess, your questions too, and the question of the gentleman in
biologist, and I had 3 questions, but I can make one out of it because they are connected. So cope with the stress for future changes. But I think stress in one part of the world might be diseases like infections, called infections, but in the other part of the world, like our parts here, we have drug addiction, we have Alzheimer's, we have depression. So minimizing stress, I'm relating to the lady before, I think it's just that people have the possibility to live a decent life and be respected, and this is to have a job and to have an income, because otherwise you're never free. There's no freedom for you if you have to act like people want you to act because you cannot survive. And this means that we have to think about a European subsidy, because this is an unconditional income which can change a lot of stress. This is one thing that people need who are not so much in the process of the work. And the other thing which I mentioned very often is that when we had a better level in the production, we did not diminish the working hours. We just worked the same hours or a little bit less, but we produced, let's say, 70 times more. So we could have thought about diminishing the stress by diminishing the working hours and having people better conditions for living in families and with friends. So I think it's all about stress that has to do with the survival and the jobs. And the last point is that we count the disaster we do to the GDP, because all diseases, all catastrophes, all in English is wars, all war. I'm sorry, at the moment I forgot it. All wars, they are a product and increase our GDP. So we have to say this, because people know it, but they never tell. And this is the right audience here, although it's small.
Please.
The question is, why don't we talk about that people cannot be free because they don't have the income they need. They don't have the job, they don't have the subsidy they need. Thank you.
So we're talking about stress relief through minimum income, which would be generated through a subsidy regime at European level. Two of you, please, and then we...
I want to underline what you have said now, because I think people are free only when they have time enough and when they have money enough to live. And you can't see here, I think, anyone who has a child, because they struggle for their life. They have to run to do their job, and therefore they can't say anything here, and therefore we are sitting here for them. And we have let it come to a situation that they have to struggle because we didn't speak enough to them, I think, the parents with the children, and now they have lost the social competence to speak to each other. And we shouldn't say they don't do anything when they are listening, when they're reading in internet, because it's the only way to hear what happens in the world or to see what happens in the world, because the media don't tell us. Even if someone goes to Thailand, he says it's a nice country, but he never knows what you have shown us today.
Again, please, could you
And
please try to pose a question?
And therefore, I mean, we have to give, to get more democracy, to give the people more power. They have challenges enough, but they can't do them because they don't have the money. And so I say, are you for an unconditional basic income for the people? and then for a shortage of working time, because we have to share the working time in jobs if we want to make a job. I am for these two to solve these problems, and then it will be also possible to have more ecology in the world.
Will you be addressing the same issue, because you approached me beforehand and saw that you were referring... No, the gentleman right next to you was raising the hand, because you were addressing me on the issue of unconditional income. Okay.
And Mr. Meadows, I wanted to ask, because he says he doesn't contact the persons who are in governments, because it's the only chance, I think. Don't you think so?
Okay, my point is
please, please, no points.
Okay, no warming on this planet. It's a short message. What I want to add to Mr. Knoblacher is the democracy in Switzerland has a possibility that the decision-making process is by the citizens, and they have, for example, made an initiative to introduce unconditional basic income in Switzerland. And the vote will be 1916. So I think there the people can do something. Thank you.
Yes, to sum up, the focus of the intervention was on jobs and the financial security that comes with a job situation, which might also be in part provided by a societal consensus that an unconditional income is appropriate, and I interpret you, would possibly remove the pressure from a system which argues it must invest into growth, because growth will create jobs and will create income through investing into jobs. That was the idea, and Dennis and the others, I guess, on the podium are requested if they may wish to comment on that.
Some years ago, this is a story about jobs, it makes a point. Some years ago, I was in Klein-Basertal, which many of you know is a part of Austria, which isn't connected to the rest of Austria, except by foot. At least in those days, you could drive into Germany, but not into Austria. And in Klein-Basertal was a bank, and because it was an Austrian bank, it had secrecy in those days, and the bank business was basically taking money from Munich. So every day you would see these Mercedes-Benz driving up with a big trunk full of money to stick in the bank, because it was secret, they didn't have to pay taxes. But the bank secrecy law was going to change. Austria had to come into compliant with the rest of the European Union. And the bankers asked me as a consultant, how can we keep our jobs? What can we do after the bank secrecy goes away that we keep our high income and our multi-hundred millions of dollars deposits and so forth? How can we do that? My answer was, you can't.
And you shouldn't.
Too bad for you. There's something like that going on here. The fundamental problem, a fundamental problem we face is that the globe has taken its population, its use of materials, and its use of energy up to levels which cannot be sustained. Now, it's a complex system, and in this system are jobs and leaders and all sorts of things. But when you start to take one little piece of the big system and ask, what can we do to fix it so that everybody will be okay there? The answer is nothing. It's not possible. Now this depends on your point of view. You could say, well, it's a very pessimistic outcome. I don't think so. I think we are more likely to be happy in the future if we spend our time deciding which of several possible outcomes we most prefer. Now we are spending our time deciding which of several impossible outcomes we most prefer. That doesn't take you, to good solutions. Jobs has become a justification for many policies. And this is not my area of specialty, so I don't imagine to say great things about it. But what I can say is that our concept of a job is a relatively recent idea. 400 or 500 years ago, people didn't have jobs. They didn't go to work in the morning and get paid and with this money, etc. No, this is something which occurred in the last couple hundred years. And we shouldn't imagine that for the next 200,000 years, somehow, this concept is going to be the fundamental objective of our society. At the moment, it is politically important because politically important people use it as a way to try and understand what to do to justify action and so forth. So we have to deal with it. But we shouldn't think that it's somehow a constant truth about our society, which we have to fix. Just one more thing about jobs, but it also applies to democracy in Switzerland. I was talking earlier today to one person who, Fritz, I was talking to Fritz Hinterberger, he's still here. Fritz is running a very important, interesting environmental research group in Austria. And we were talking about size, and he said that, to be short, that now he has about 15 people. He sees that there's something special about the communication patterns for 15 people. And in my own experience, I have been in charge of institutes with 100, 200 people even. And I have seen, as the size goes up, the quality of the interaction, the nature of the social connections profoundly changes. And I think, in the distant future, it will turn out that the systems we have built now, the democracies, the corporations, are simply too big. They demand properties that we simply don't have. And so, if you have I have created companies. I've started companies and run companies. If you have a company of 5 or 10, 15 people, the notion of jobs and pay and responsibility is very different. Much more flexible, much more tuned to the needs of the individual person than when you get into a really big corporation. One of the strengths of Switzerland is that it remained fairly small. It has kept power in relatively small units. And trust, it seems to me, is not the reason it works. It's a result of the scale. So some of these questions that you're asking, how to do this, how to do that, I think may not have a good answer when you're dealing with very large systems. It's an interesting thing about the European Union. It started quite small, and it doesn't seem to have any understanding about how big it should get. Now we want to put the Ukraine and Latvia and the Baltics and Turkey should it. This is crazy in my mind. It's making a huge mistake about where we have the capacity really to do something different. So this question of scale, just to finish up, is absolutely at the foundation of many of these questions: democracy, jobs, and so forth. And if you don't get clear about scale, then I don't think you will find the good answers.
Dennis gave a very interesting system dynamic workshop to the bank. Dennis gave a very good system dynamics workshop to the bankers in Pembasatar. to make it a little bit easier for them to understand. There's no
why they should go to lose their job.
Well, concerning the question of aging population, I grew up in a farmhouse where 2 people were under 65 and 6 people were over 65. And nobody had any fear. Everybody has something to do. Everybody has a certain role. If you have people who have always work, there was not very much money on the way, sometimes no money at all. But we were self-sufficient and everybody was happening, and we had a lot of freedom, singing and gathering and fighting and whatever is necessary in society and in the village too. After World War II, 3 people under 65 were in the household, but 6 over 65 were there. So I think it is no problem if you arrange it in the right way. And the question is to equal. We are talking obviously about equality, but concerning the power equality, I think means everybody should have access to the same amount of money, not by, I would say, unconditional income, but unconditional opportunities to do some work instead of restricting the slots. What kind of work is possible for you? Because when there are people, my friend Leopold Kohl said, if you have people somewhere, you have always a lot of work. Because if a child is born, you have a lot of work. When the people are going elder and the people are very old, it is always a lot of work around. And so there will be always a lot of work. We have just to rearrange the work into human scale instead of industrial scale. And not let everything do with the robotics and the information system. We had many years ago this very nice information system where you have a computer system at home and you can take care of handicapped people and so on, and somebody, if you need something, what the people really need is a touch of a hand or something like that, or a hug or something. It is much more important for them to get any information from somebody who is totally anonymous. I think technology has fascinated us too much. People are small and sensitive, and we must take care of them.
I'd like to contribute to some disharmony before everybody starts to applaud, but Dennis wants to come in.
Coming back to this question of jobs, the underlying idea is somehow, so it's an objective fact. Some people aren't able to get a situation which pays them enough money to satisfy their needs in the market, food and so on. And so the idea is somehow we have to produce more in order to create jobs for these people. Well, the situation is in some ways like food. There are a lot of hungry people in the world who do not have enough food to eat. And so we hear often this, we need genetically modified food, we need new technology, we need better, etc., in order to produce more food so that the people won't be hungry. The fact is, in the world today, we produce enough food to feed everybody. The problem, it's not distributed very well. We produce enough income, we produce enough heat, we produce enough energy, we produce enough housing to satisfy everybody. The problem is the mechanisms for allocating this don't work. I think it would be more productive to focus on the mechanisms of allocation than on trying desperately to stimulate the scale of the production. We are actually, I think, if you look back, since the Second World War for 20, 30 years, you can argue that increasing the level of production was socially beneficial. It actually solved a lot of problems. It raised standards and so forth. I think we've come into a period now where raising the scale of production actually makes society poorer. It's creating more costs than benefits. The difference is that the costs are wide and sometimes in the future, and the benefits are very narrowly focused on a relatively small group, typically the people who are advocating to increase the scale of production. Remember this exercise I gave this morning with the box, the secret code? One of the boxes we have is we have to create more jobs to solve problems. I don't think the answer to our problems lie inside that box.
One question.
Well, my question is education. I missed this point in your presentation. I missed the point of education. We need three factors, which is education, education, education. You can go to Singapore or India. And why is that not important?
Okay, so who wants to respond on education in general? Raising educational levels, the informed citizen, or different means of education? Education that addresses other issues than material welfare.
It's always education. It's the kind of communication, it's terminology, it's to understand the words of the other party, it's education on the future, education on what you should be doing, basic education on the digital society we are in. And I don't understand, because if you go to India or Singapore, etc., then the people say, everybody says, I want to be educated. And we do it. The only thing I see which is short, which is coping with the stress of future changes, is education.
We use that interventionals to kind of sum up individually, I guess, the challenges and the shortcomings in the educational system, but also in competing goals in the educational system. Obvious, maybe this is something we could jointly reflect on and combine it with some concluding remarks on today, because we're approaching 5 o'clock.
Just one comment. I think the pictures we have seen today from Japan, Fukushima, and we have seen them in Thailand. These pictures are related with our habits and our technology. And this kind of technology has been produced by extremely well-educated people. So we must be very carefully. I think you are seeing, I agree with you that education is necessary, but it is important what we are educated, what we understand under education. Because traditional way of education is increase the skills for something to make life by using artificial energy or something like that thing. But I agree with you that this is not the right way. This is not the right way. But I think it is necessary to explain, because if we are talking about education, going to school, universities and something like that, then they will produce an outcome which is producing problems. But if we produce education which increase the empathy, the understanding of the system, the feeling, the knowledge about the evolutionary relationships which can be shown today and something like that, I think this is what you mean. But you will not find this kind of education in the school system. This is one of the problems we have today.
Anybody else? Who wants to take that opportunity for some concluding remarks on today's debate and the challenges we will be touching upon?
Actually, I saw in the conversation today an enormous attention to education, but in a broad sense. Education, the important education, is not what happens in a classroom. I mentioned about democracy. True democracy is where people have a sense of personal responsibility. That can be acquired through a process of education, but it's not the education which a person in a classroom. Democracy is possible where the leaders have a sense of moral and ethical responsibility for the future welfare of the country instead of simply trying to maximize the benefits for them or their family or their tribe or whatever. That's also a kind of education, but it's not the sort of education which occurs in a classroom. I have a friend who's a Turk, a very wise Turkish banker, who works in the central bank in Turkey. And his grandmother was an educator. She was a storyteller in a small village out in the east of the country. And in her village, often the people would come together and she would start to tell stories. These are stories about morality, responsibility, honesty, and so forth. And the stories would go well into the night. And when people left, they had accumulated a lot of new understanding and information. That's an important kind of information. We often talk about technology as a solution for problems, but we forget the fact that technology is being created by people to serve their goals. Most of the technology which is being developed in my country is from funding by the military and by corporations. And their goal is not to solve long-term global problems. Their goal is, in the case of the military, to develop means of projecting power, and in the case of corporations, means of sequestering some part of the market for short-term profit. If we had education in the big sense, then we could see that technology would start to evolve in ways that would be really helpful for us. If we don't have that kind of education, then the technology is going to continue, as Herman pointed out, to cause the kind of problems that we're seeing. So I think we're all educated. I mean, today has been an exercise in education, just in an important way. But I agree with you strongly. Without education in the big sense, there is no solution for these problems.
I also agree with you. Education is very important, but I believe that education within the box of code, for example, this code, that is not the education we would like to have. But we need to have education to help young people to see out of the box, so to speak. Nowadays, in Japan as well, education is something for more growth with higher efficiency. So education in Japan means to get educated to be able to sell yourself to big companies. But the things that are not taught now is that money is not the end, it's just means. Or in Japan, back in Edo or Meiji era, there is an important distinction between the money-generating job and unpaid work for community or for the future. There's a very big, important distinction. And people valued the unpaid work for community over the paid money-generating job. Or the thing that is not true right now is there are three kinds of economy, for example. One is money economy, and second is self-sufficient economy, so producing your food, and the third one is barter economy, so giving something to other people or receiving something from other people. I talked about the 3D movement among young people in Japan. Actually, what they are doing is to taking or they're regaining the proper balance between the three economies. So they are reducing the percentage of the money economy aspect in their life. But they're creating a community relationship so that they can receive food or vegetables from farmers nearby, or they can produce their own food. So how to regain or how to make the right balance between the three economies, that is very important. But these kind of things are not taught. So I really agree with you that education is very important, but not education given by the establishment. So how to give another alternative kind of education, that is the challenge we face.
I agree also that education is necessary, but we mentioned some problems related with the generalization of education, because if education only focused on technology, I think we still have, because we need also education and social competence and ability to solve social problems. But there's an additional problem, because I think it shows our boundaries of what we can change, because there are several arguments for freedom of people and for the decision of people. If the human society tries to occupy and to cope with much more processes of ecosystem, so we have also to take over a lot of tasks which are not convenient. We have to clean waste and so on. And at the moment, a lot of societies are working because they have a lot of less educated, which are operating with waste, with the argument that you are not educated, so the best what you can do to separate this one. So we have to think about the possibility and the potential which we have as human society to work together within society in well-educated situations, and in which, where are the boundaries, we lose the freedom because of the necessities, because we have to do both tasks which are not convenient for people. I will stop.
It's time to come to an end, and this cannot be an ending of this session by some great concluding remarks, because I guess I would be not the person in place to really summarize that in a way everybody would be satisfied. I think it is justified to say that I'd like to echo what Dennis said, that this event here was a learning experience for many of us.
Yes.
Certainly for me. It's a learning experience in many respects. A learning experience because in this context we were debating with you issues which we typically do debate in much more narrow framework. Me coming out of an environment ministry, typically debate these things with the usual suspects. And unfortunately, the usual suspects typically are people who exactly have the same opinion than I do, and always claim that it's important to change things, but relate and refer to things and actors behind the things which are outside the room. So one of our challenges, I guess, is getting this kind of debate, which was in an extended format today, and in similar formats, further out of our closed circles and groups of people who agree. Let's engage in that kind of debate with the regular business community. As painful and as difficult and as step by step it might be, but we need that. We need to cross that kind of virtual border we all too often do not cross. The joint interest to co-organize this meeting between a bureaucratic institution and the Club of Vienna and the Club of Rome is one of these attempts to move out of these constraints of our typical approaches. And the thing I can at least try to promise as the conclusion from my side is that I found it very worthwhile, and I'll do my best to contribute to make that happen more often in other circumstances, and certainly and by heart with your two institutions as most welcome and very much satisfying partners for this kind of debate. Thank you very much. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen, very much for staying with us for an entire day. It was a full working day in terms of how we define a working day. We had a 1 hour lunch break and 8 hours of very constructive interactions. And I again would like to thank you for visiting us, and may already announce right now that this will not be the last time we'll be approaching you and others to discuss with us on issues of core interest, I guess. Thank you very much.